Okay, so I want to start by thanking Stephanie, Damien, and everyone at CSREA and COCIT for making today possible and for inviting me to be the moderator today. I also want to begin by saying that Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe have been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to these actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. I now want to although they're going to speak obviously one at a time, I'm going to introduce all of the speakers now. Jacques Pierre was born in Cap Haitien in the northern coast of Haiti. He has been teaching Haitian Kreyol since 2010 at Duke University, where his classes also include students from the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University by teleconference. Before his arrival at Duke, Jacques taught at Florida International University and at the Creole Institute at Indiana University. Jacques is an outspoken advocate for the use of Creole at all levels in Haiti and as a means of helping create a more inclusive society. Adrienne Lo, and I should say that we have the panelists in the order that I am introducing them. Adrienne Lo is a linguistic anthropologist. She is the co-editor of Beyond Yellow English Towards a Linguistic Anthropology of Asian Pacific America, published by Oxford in 2009, and South Korea's Education Exodus, The Life and Times of Study Abroad. Her current research examines etiologies of multilingualism in the South Korean popular media and the history of the racialization of Asian American linguistic competencies. Lance Twitchell is an American scholar, poet, and language revitalization advocate. He works as an associate professor at Alaska Native Languages at the University of Alaska Southeast. Finally, Dr. Joseph C. Hill, is an associate professor in the Department of ASL and Interpreting Education, associate director of the Center on Culture and Language, and assistant dean for faculty recruitment and retention at Rochester University of Technology's National Technical Institutes for the Deaf. His research interests are the socio-historical and sociolinguistic aspects of Black American Sign Language and the American deaf community's attitudes and ideologies about existing signing varieties. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacques Pierre. I'll talk today about Haitian Kreyol as a symbol of linguistic resistance, creation, and freedom. To start, I would like to say I'm very happy to be here at Brown University. What a beautiful day. It reminds me home a little bit, but the weather has always been nice to us. At any rate, it's good to leave Durham for a couple of days to meet new people, especially Caribbean scholars. Thank you all for being here, the audience and scholars who share the panel with me. I know there are so many events on campus now, but the simple fact that you've chosen this event shows your incredible interest in the subject, and I deeply appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Larieux, for the invitation. I will never decline an invitation when it comes to speak about Creole, my mother tongue, a subject I hold dear to my heart, the language I've been promoting here and in my beloved land, Haiti, for more than 25 years and for the rest of my life. My prepared remarks are divided into three parts, as mentioned in the title of my topic. First, linguistic resistance. It's inconceivable to talk about Haiti without mentioning how the country got its independence from France on January 1st, 1804. As you all know, my African ancestors were savagely captured in Africa and brutally brought to Saint-Domingue to work the sugarcane plantation in harsh and inhuman conditions to make France prosperous. At that time, the linguistic landscape was as follows. First, French was the language of the oppressors, white French colonists. Second, a multitude of several African languages spoken by the enslaved people. Given the fact that most enslaved people did not specifically share one language in common, it was quite impossible for them to communicate and join forces quickly and cast off the shackles of slavery. However, the harsh working condition, the shocking number of deaths among themselves due to the hellish conditions of their lives, and the barbarities they had endured pushed them to fight for their lives because their life expectancy on the plantation was very limited. Despite the horrendous conditions and the psychological abuses the enslaved people had to go through, they knew deep in their hearts that they were human beings, just like the oppressors. Therefore, they stood up and fought to their last breath to make their voices heard by stating, quote in Creole, "Tout monde c'est moun." We are all created equal. That solidarity among the enslaved people would not have happened if they had not been able to communicate with each other in the language they created, which is Creole. While creating this language, it was the sole vector of communication to resist, plan, strategize the battle plan, and fight for their freedom. And as the saying goes, communication is power. Now I'll talk about the second one, creation. Creole, as any other language, has emerged from contact between human beings. At that time, the enslavers did not think of the enslaved people as human beings like them. But it's clear this way of thinking from the enslaver did not show an ounce of humanity because they deliberately refused to understand or admit that the skin color of the enslaved people made them look different from them, talking about the oppressors. But as human beings, we all have the same biological and anatomical components that make a body work or function. It's clear that the social conditions in which Creole was born were different from other languages. But no one can deny the fact that Creole was created through contact between human beings regardless of social status. These people had a necessity to communicate with each other. And what they had done was exactly what this proverb states. Necessity is the mother of invention. Now, the last one, freedom. After more than 200 years, Haiti has remained a Creole-speaking country, despite the desire of some educated Haitians to portray the country as simply a Francophone country. The situation sometimes makes others who are not keenly aware of the linguistic situation in Haiti fall into the trap that Haiti is a strictly Francophone country. As an example, on November 6, 2022, just recently, the newspaper Jamaica Gleaner states the following, quote, "The Haitian government has joined the United Nations and other humanitarian partners in launching a $145.6 million US appeal to support the French-speaking Caribbean countries' emergency cholera response. Although the entire population speaks Creole, French remains the language of the public administration, especially in written form. The linguistic freedom I'm talking about can be seen into two scopes. First, ancestors created the language to free themselves from their oppressors. Second, in 1987, Article 5, Haitian Constitution, after more than 200 years, Creole, the language spoken by the entire population, was finally recognized as official. It was a big step in the right direction because there's no way we can improve the lives of all Haitians, especially the marginalized ones, if they do not have a say in the political and educational debate of the country. The question that needs to be asked, how can they have a say if they are not literate and educated in their own language? To conclude, Creole has come so far, but there's a long way to go. The language, in some instances, can be seen as a model of resistance, creation, and freedom. Ancestors have built a language to affirm their existence in the world and to create a new life where the skin color should not be seen as a symbol of superiority. As a matter of fact, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, one of the forefathers of Haitian independence, told us to keep our language, Tchembe Langano, in Creole. Naturally, Haitians were and are supposed to be taught in their native language, Haitian Creole. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and is still not the case in large part. It wasn't until 1979, thanks to the reform Bernard, a reform that mandates that Creole become the language of instruction, especially in the first 10 years of schooling. Since then, Creole has been moving forward, and I'm very confident that one day Creole will be the language of instruction at all levels of education, because this is the only language that unites all Haitians, and the only one through which people can capture the heartbeat of the country. Kudos to all the universities around the world, especially many universities in the United States that have been offering Haitian Creole, so that new scholars who want to work in Haiti, on Haiti, and with Haiti will be linguistically and culturally equipped to understand Haiti, yon lot gens, with a positive high. Thank you.
Atlan gulchish yukatangi ukecha. Gulchish yuechati iki. Achtu yake hasta ane kokaya yukatani. Eshukat kau. Naraganzit. Achtu yake khat yati kalch khataya koa. Ya akhlil kohas. Ach in khasati. Ach shat ach yaki. Achtu litsini khasati. Yewa achtu asagu choya. Khatu kakhsa kehin. Yuchidut leha ya yagi. Yalte kat yohan. Ade aya yeji ni ye yukatangi kach. Khanea aksai. Ya ha yukatangi ya kai khashatu. Ak kwan anikuk. Shkuti duasaka anikua. Ya chatlikat wishakat kuach tuasaku hasti yukatangi kekuchlitsini. Ajoya datwe yukakwatan. Ya yidat datatinach saha yatiyak. Chatlikat ya ha anikuk. Ya ta'ayat ani, klingit ani, chagutku kunana. Wujinye jagachtune, chiklaya, wujintuchat yesu gunchish. Thank you for sharing your words. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the indigenous peoples upon whose lands I am privileged to speak today, the language of my ancestors. Jade khatni utati jit khoti akhi khatangi yat ashukat ewe akhi aushatu ya je itek kunakaya yukhatan kashwe kukakana khaya kakitu. Please forgive me to the interpreters for not providing my words before I came here, but the way I was taught is you speak from your heart. You're not supposed to go, I take notes, I'm not even supposed to take notes. That's the way that we're taught when we speak our language at home. My name is Lance Twitchell. I am honored to be here. I am here based upon the strength and courage of my wife and children. They are my source of courage and inspiration, as are the speakers and the students and the future speakers of Hayukatangi, our language. If you live in North America and you are an indigenous person, the very survival of your language is an act of resistance. The ways that our languages have been targeted for annihilation, for genocide, has been intentional. And even after our attempted erasure, most people are never taught about what has happened to our peoples. The peoples who are here, the peoples in our land, those who work in indigenous languages. And so when we talk about language as power, when we talk about overcoming attempted annihilation on the places where our languages were born, and this attempted replace of a native identity. For us at home, we call ourselves Alaska Natives. It's a political term. But a lot of settlers and descendants of settlers like to call themselves Native Alaskans. They say, oh, well, Native Alaskans means you were born here. And I say, no. Because we have to recognize indigeneity and we have to recognize colonization. Because that's how we achieve decolonization. I'm thankful to be invited here to Brown University, thankful to the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. I think this is a critical time to increase the focus on these studies as America tends to move itself away from recognizing diversity and towards a fear of talking about the differences of our peoples and the differences of our histories and what it will take for all of us to be able to survive and to thrive in ways that are natural to us. Let's see if this thing works. As this thing, I would be surprised if it works at this point. I don't know where I pointed. Okay, there we go. I have to tell you, I took a flight yesterday at 5 p.m. from that spot, Juneau, Alaska. We call it Occoquan. I don't know who this Juneau guy is, but it's not that important to me. And the flight was delayed. We've got some things going on at home. I said, I can only be gone for a little while. I gotta get home. And so I was gonna have like a little bit more time to be here and to settle and to get ready. But as things went, I had to adjust my travel. And then the flight got delayed. And then I was told, 0% chance you'll make your connecting flight in Seattle. And I said, well, maybe I'll just go home because if I miss it, I can't get there until about an hour from now. And so as I'm sitting in Ketchikan, Alaska, I said, well, if this plane does leave, I'm going to get on it. If it leaves before 6 p.m., I'll get on it and I'll just see what happens. Got to Seattle, ran, they had closed the doors to the other airplane, and then they opened it after mouthing a very bad word. And then I got on the plane, got here. Alaska Airlines, Alaska Airlines then lost my bag. But I'm still here, and I tried to make myself fancy for this. Luckily, I had an hour to shop and a half an hour to shower, and this is just how the adventure goes sometimes. But this is our land. It's Tlingit Ani. We are Tlingit peoples. We speak and we still live with our language, which was, people attempted to remove it from the place where it was born. For indigenous languages, if you remove them from their lands, they are gone forever. And what we're talking about is, for us, is a 15,000-year connection to a particular place, a language that was born in a place, lives in a place, belongs in a place. And I think there needs to be more discussion right now about what we are doing for indigenous languages. And so my proposal is, if you graduate high school in Alaska, you need to take 1 semester of one of our 23 indigenous languages. It has to be part of the curriculum. It has to be part of the standard. It has to be accepted that our languages are here and are never going anywhere else. We have a pretty large territory. We're in both Canada and the United States. I'm not good at geography. I know our lands pretty well, but once I got here, I fell asleep in the car and I woke up, I was like, I have no idea where I am. But I'm happy to be here. Okay, where does this go? Did I go to? Okay. We have a pretty large territory. We have dialects within our language. We are trying to maintain our dialects. I believe at this point probably 3 of them, perhaps, maybe 4, have a really good chance of surviving, whereas the other several different variations of our language might go to sleep for a while. But we try to look at our territory, find out where folks are from. As we teach them our language, we try to make sure that they can then speak as their ancestors would have. We have 61 sounds in our language. I learned Hawaiian. It was very fun, and I was very interested with what they did with their vowels. And I said, you guys want to borrow some consonants? We got a lot of them. We've got a lot of fun sounds, and we teach through Zoom. We have students. Anytime we're teaching, we have students from all over the place who are learning with us, because there are very few places where you can learn our language, and also very few places where you can speak our language with other people's. We have fun words like kuk, which is a little swan, and wakachechu, which are eyelashes, and this thing, I think I have a straw on there, but this thing is called atunachu atutli atki at, a thing that people talk through. So we have this phrase, which is like to hold your spirit steady, because I want to share some information with you that is sometimes hard to hear, especially if you're a human being with compassion, which not everybody is. Most people are human beings, but not all of them have compassion. And so I wanted to share a picture of children. That's my baby. I like to take her around and just sort of think of them. They were born and raised with our Tlingit language. This generation, we have several children who are being raised with their language, but we went about 60 years without raising any birth speakers, and not by our choice. We had to sign a piece of paper in order to become a citizen of the United States of America, in order to claim land, decide what schools our kids could go to, and vote. And that piece of paper said, I will not speak my language, live my life, I will be white. And we had to get a white school teacher to sign it, and then find 5 other white people who would also sign it, so that they could verify that we were not going to be ourselves. So I'm very pleased that our children can be themselves. They know our language, they speak our language. It's fun to hear how they put it together. Every kid loves fart jokes in every language, so that's very fun. Whenever you want them to talk about something, it's going to be but or something like that. But that's great, because it's a living language, and it's very fun. But also they understand our cultural values, they understand who we are, they understand who they are, they understand these connections that were denied to several generations behind them. So in Alaska, every single language is endangered. Yupik is the safest language, and there's a variation, there's a language called St. Lawrence Island Yupik, which is the safest of them. Probably 90% of the people speak it, 95. Western Yupik has about 10,000 speakers, and then it goes down from there, and this is a color-coded chart, and the ones that are red are in a lot of trouble. A lot of our languages have gone down to 0 speakers. We don't like to use the term extinct. We like to use the term sleeping, because maybe we will have a chance to wake them up. Our language has about 200 people actively learning and speaking today, but if I were to say, let's just speak Tlingit all day, there's probably about 40 human beings left in the world that I can talk to. Most of them are over 80 years old, and I was just having a conversation with someone the other day. I said, if all your friends are 90, you've got a short time to be with them. And we tell our students, we said, you are in a very special situation, and you need to prepare yourself. You will get yourself to a point where you'll be one of the only people in the world that can understand what these elders are telling you. And you will receive these gifts, and then you will lose them. But you are the critical bridge between them and our ancestors and our future generations. As we sit there holding on, it's like we're just holding on to this little, like we're just pushed out of the boat, and we're just holding on to this little part of the boat in the icy waters, just trying to survive. My hope is, like, through discussions like this, through forums like this, that there can be more awareness of what indigenous peoples are doing, what they need, and what we can shift. Education in America is typically a white supremacist institution, completely lacking authenticity as far as indigenous voices and content and languages. And so we're trying to change that. So this is like a really big, fancy university. It's very fun to be here. Our universities were very small. But because we're small, we can embrace decolonization and equity at a foundational level. Not to say it can't happen here and at other universities, but I would like to know, like, which indigenous languages are taught here. Do people have to pay for them? We've recently found a way to have our languages be tuition-free. If people just want to learn them, they could just sign up and learn them. But it took a lot. And it took a lot of our indigenous peoples and organizations raising money in order to make that happen. I don't know if I have anything left. And so because of that, we're on this trajectory growth. So I said there's 40 people that can speak our language, but right now, there's hundreds of people who are learning. So I do think it's going to change. And so we study a lot with people in Hawaii. We study a lot with people who are trying to do things to create these futures that are not futures of loss, but are futures of gain. We're also encouraging everybody who lives in our territory to learn our language. We're trying to put our place names back onto the land so we don't have Joe's Mountain and Bob's River. You know, there's a lot of things named after white guys where we live. And then a lot of those white guys didn't like our people. And so we're not trying to erase anybody's history, but we're trying to say, you know what, there was a name here. And maybe I'll close with this kind of thought. So I was talking with a colleague, and I said, oh, we're putting all these place names back. It's very exciting, because the name of this glacier, it doesn't mean anything. And he says, well, it means something to me. I've been hiking there for like 10 years. I said, well, I'm not talking about sentimental value to yourself. I'm talking about, what does that name mean? I'm not going to say that name, because I want to say that guy's name. And he said, well, it's been called that for like 100 years. And he put emphasis on 100, right? And so I said, okay. Well, let's say your grandmother's name was Nora. She's 90 years old. And I meet her, and I'm calling her Sarah. And then at some point you say, hey, my grandma's name is Nora, you keep calling her Sarah. And if my response to you was, I've been calling her Sarah for like 2 days now. And that's why I want to keep calling her Sarah. And so what we're trying to sort of figure out here is a reawakening of indigenous identity and knowledge, and coming to grips with what colonization is and has done, especially when we look at the genocide piece, which which a lot of people don't like to look at. So thank you for listening. I look forward to what the other panelists have to present.
Okay, I guess I'll stay here. Yeah, I was trying to decide whether I was going to stand so that I'll be more easily seen or sit, but I think I have better lighting than I'm sitting here, so we'll just proceed with me sitting. You gotta move that microphone. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you, Brown, for inviting me to be a part of this panel, as I will discuss Black American Sign Language in America. Most people still have no clue what Black American Sign Language is, even though we have had several publications to date. There are still people that have not been exposed to it, and so I was invited to discuss it and be part of this panel today. So for this discussion, I'm going to summarize different things that I have seen, basically the history of Black American Sign Language, and then I will discuss about since its founding or since the beginning to date, and why people are still not in the know about Black American Sign Language, and then I will discuss what the future looks like. So a little bit of past, present, and future. I have this clicker, sorry. There we go. So now, people may ask, what is Black American Sign Language? Where did it come from? I think it's important for you all to be aware that most people don't know that American Sign Language is not a universal language. You know, everywhere in the world has their own unique sign language relative to their country or their respective region. You know, countries and communities within communities, they have their own distinct language. It is not a universal one-size-fits-all type of language. So that's one thing. And also, it's not a following English structure. So it's not a direct English to American Sign Language. There are two distinct languages. And so you may see people mouthing English words while they're signing. It happens. You know, deaf people who are bilingual, they begin to internalize English word coding, mouth morphemes, and English principles, and English language structure. But they are definitely different and distinct based on how someone is to express themselves locally, regionally, but there are variations, and it is distinct from English, so it's important to know that. And also for Black American Sign Language, that applies as well. A little bit on the history. I have here a timeline on the slides that you can see. I'll give you a moment to look at the slide and take it all in, and then let me know when you're ready. Okay. It's important that you notice at the bottom, you see that red line? Black American Sign Language has been around for over 150 years. At the first residential school for the deaf that was founded in North Carolina. And so other states began to found and establish schools for the deaf. And in the South, those schools did not sign the same style because there were different regionalisms based on contact with the community and the language. And so amongst those states, there are variations in that language. And so if you look at that black line above it, you'll see mainstream ASL. And you'll see you see the founding of the American School for the Deaf. And that's where language originated in France and was brought over to the Americas. And that's where acquisition began to spread and disseminate throughout the United States over 200 years ago. So during that time, residential schools for the deaf had American Sign Language as the language that was used in the classroom to communicate. And then around 1880, there was a conference for deaf education that most of the people were not deaf, but they all convened and made the decision to outlaw sign language in schools. They felt like that would incline people to be averse to speech and speaking, or a form of, in that time, normalcy, since that was popular and it had a global impact. And so from that moment on, people who were using American Sign Language started to resist in different ways. For example, they tried to preserve their American Sign Language through filmmaking. And that happened in 1913, as you can see on the slide. In 1965, it was Dr. William Stokey, this is his sign name, and also his deaf assistant. Those two did an analysis and they realized that there are variations and the sign language did not follow English structure. And so how did we find a way to resist? And to those who said that it wasn't a language and something was wrong with it, no, it was an actual language. And so there were different ways that people who, did different studies on American Sign Language and its impact on the deaf community and how it became a collective resistance. But Black American Sign Language was not protected. They didn't have those same protections as white or mainstream American Sign Language back then. Sorry, I'm clicking on the computer and I mean to use the clicker. And so the Black American Sign Language has been here, as I mentioned, over 150 years, but for our work and my research team's work, we started working together in 2007. We came together and we decided to go to 6 different states. Now, other states definitely have Black deaf residential schools for the deaf, but because of financial and grant constraints, we had picked 6 states out of those because we had to travel to and the related expenses, so we couldn't do all 18, we had to choose 6. So we collected all of that data as it relates to language and also notated or documented the school experiences in those 6 states. And then for each state, we had 2 groups. We had the under 35 group and we had the older 55 and up group. And those age groups are significant because the 55 and up group had already experienced segregation in the residential schools. And they were at schools when they were only using mainstream ASL, but the 35 and under experienced an integrated school system. And so that's where things began to mix and evolve. And so we wanted to study the differences between those 2 groups. So you can see the information related to that project. There's a video of each different chapter, and I'll explain that explains our work that is available. You can take a picture of this if you want. Thank you for the reminder about the clicker. All good? So during our studies, we see a focus on different features of American Sign Language as it relates to philosophy and phonological variation, hand shapes, 1 hand or 2 hands, location of the sign, the signing space, and also we looked at vocabulary variances. And there's some that had already been studied, dating back to the 70s. There was one person who was a social linguist who did studies in collaborative efforts. And as time went on, the amount of studies definitely decreased. And later down the line, you started to see those features reemerge. And we started to notice several differences. And so some of the things that we noticed was that those feature differences were based on geography. And we noticed that, based on previous studies that we reapplied, we found similarities as well as differences. And also we noticed that they were based on contact, and that meant Black deaf people who had already been in integrated spaces, and they were able to converse with the Black community with African American English involved as well, and so we had a strong inclination towards contact as a factor as well. So why didn't we know about Black ASL decades ago? And there's still some that don't know, and why is that the case? I'm going to provide several examples that we can look at and that explain what happened. I think it's extremely important. I see, well, let me allow y'all to look at the slide for a minute and take it all in. Okay. So for this work, I think it's extremely important to emphasize intersectionality and have that frame going into this work. Often people are aware of different layers and levels of systemic oppression that influence this work, that influence language, that influence and impact the community, but also oftentimes people don't think about ableism, being oppressed based on their disability, and also autism, oppression of deaf people or people with the inability to hear. So those groups of people that have disabilities that are related to hearing is also tied to language. And so often people think about just language. And I also want to emphasize that there are several layers to this, and thinking about how it actually impacts the deaf community, how race, ableism, and autism all play a part. I know this is a busy slide, so I wanted to give you a second to take it all in and look at those numbers. Okay, for American Sign Language, you're going to think about how deaf people acquire language in American Sign Language through schools. Yes, there's a few families that know sign language and use sign language in the home, but typically it's acquired at the residential schools for the deaf when you're immersed in the language. And so thinking about prior to the 60s, many deaf children would go to the residential school for the deaf. It wasn't close to home. They would actually go pretty far and they would stay on campus year round. So going over the years, because of changes in the educational laws, the number of children going to deaf schools or residential schools for the deaf went down. It became the choice of the parents, but that definitely had an impact on language and language exposure. So around 2010, the number of deaf students that were going to residential schools for the deaf, where ASL is used primarily, went down to about 25%, where before it was at 80%. So it's a drastic difference. But still, there are a lot of people who are encouraged to use American Sign Language in different ways. There are laws to protect the use of said language. But when it comes to Black American Sign Language, that's a completely different story. So since segregation, there was the use of language in silos, essentially, until integration happened. And often during that transition, Black students were expected to assimilate and looked down upon based on their language use. And so that meant that Black American Sign Language in schools started to dwindle as well and almost fade. It wasn't visible. It was visible in the community, but not from an educational standpoint. So this book that you see on the slide was extremely pivotal in history as it related to a sociolinguistic analysis of language and sign. So that the use of ASL was really important and recognized as a language, but during that time, we were also aware that we had Black American Sign Language. but they use it, they noticed that the Black deaf community used it, but they decided not to include Black deaf and Black American Sign Language in that study or that analysis. It was just that people were aware of, but not included in. So we progressed to the 80s, and at that time, we already had several different publications as it relates to Black American Sign Language. And then this happened. This book was part of an ASL resistance, an anti-English resistance. And so that meant that they felt that people were trying to change ASL to follow English structure, English coding, for example, the handshake with the letters to follow English. And there was resistance to that. There was a resistance and an inclination towards Native American Sign Language use. But during that time, people that were doing the work felt that Black American Sign Language was visibly there, but it was just too different. It was deemed as too different. And so it was marginalized or disregarded and excluded from the documentation. And that also had an impact on people's awareness of Black American Sign Language as a language. So what is Black American Sign Language now? We think about the efforts to spread awareness about Black American Sign Language now, and we have to figure out, how to preserve that language. And so one example is of a project that we did. We have a documentary that we started to disseminate about 2 years ago. And it was on PBS, maybe you all have seen it, but now it's also available on YouTube at any time, on demand, so you can watch it and learn something. We have Black American Sign Language, and it helps to spread awareness for public consumption. And on top of that, public education that's tied directly into social media and the ability to post freely and rapidly. So the Black community started to really, before, operate in silos, essentially, in small groups. And we tried to find one place that we could claim on the internet. And the internet space was a place for us to, publish, family signs and language that was seen in the home. And these were ways to preserve that language on an online space. Oops, I jumped ahead. So for now, we have two different centers doing the work focused on sign language. For example, mine, as you can see, NTID, Research Center on Cultural Linguistics. I'm still doing the work as it relates to linguistic variation, and that includes Black American Sign Language. That is an ongoing effort. I'm not the only one doing this work. I also have people that are working collectively with me to keep this work forward moving. Fortunately, Gallaudet University has a Center for Black Deaf Studies. I think it was founded last year, and they're still trying to maintain studies and continue studies on Black American Sign Language. Each language has their own unique culture and history and all the things. So soon, I believe next year in March, they're going to be hosting their very first inaugural symposium for Black Deaf Studies, where we'll be discussing this ad nauseum. And so I have a feeling at that time, there was going to be some shifts that happen as it relates to Black American Sign Language and its preservation. So thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, I just wanted to thank the organizers for organizing this incredibly exciting and stimulating symposium, and also to all of you who actually found the time to come so late in the term on a cold, dark winter day to hear us. So I appreciate your effort. And I've learned a lot from all the talks here. I'm going to go a little bit off into outer space, but I hope you'll follow me there. Okay, so They want us to learn standard English, but then they say that we always fall short. They tell us that we need to maintain our heritage languages, but mastering those is framed as compromising our ability to speak the standard. Speaking the standard is both seen as necessary for economic advancement, but also as an emblem of being whitewashed. This makes us perform a constant socio-linguistic dance, where we have to signal our ability in all of these varieties, but not too much and not in the wrong ways. I am supposed to be fully conversant in a variety that emblematizes my intellectual capabilities, but at the same time, I have to seem real. Specifically, I am supposed to demonstrate my allegiance to being Asian American sociolinguistically, when to be Asian American is to be the very exemplar of linguistic assimilation. As a second-generation Asian American, born and raised in the US, I am supposed to embody a supposed passage from the figure of the accented immigrant who can only speak bad English to a figure who has apparently no accent and no ethnolect, where an ethnolect is a linguistically distinctive variety of English that is supposed to emblematize my identity. This is what whiteness needs us to embody. In the matrix of racial formations, the trouble-free, smooth, sociolinguistic assimilation of Asian Americans is the linchpin that legitimizes the fiction that assimilation is attainable for all. After all, if it's supposedly so easy for us, then why can't everyone else also become rational neoliberal subjects who can freely make the right choices? It is this image of the Asian American that gets held up by whiteness in rebuke against those who, for some misbegotten reason, might choose to cling to their ethnolects or heritage languages. This is not a game that we can win. This is a game that we should all refuse to play. It relies upon the fiction of the liberal, sovereign subject who can supposedly choose which linguistic varieties to project. It obscures how we are read and heard by others in ways that are overdetermined before a single phoneme is even produced. I think we can intervene in this discourse in several different ways. First, we can draw inspiration from work in cultural studies by people like Lisa Lo, Ruthie Gilmore, and Paul Gilroy that has brilliantly demonstrated how race is a way of naturalizing the unequal labor relations that are at the heart of capitalism. Their work has been vital in thinking not about specific groups and their languages, which is often how sociolinguistics has been structured, but about how the whole matrix of racial formations serves to uphold whiteness. Second, I think we need to pay close attention to work in language and political economy. This work argues that ideologies of cultural authenticity in language can serve as mechanisms for perpetuating inequities. And I'm thinking here of Monica Heller's work on ethnoclass, which looks at how ideologies of francophonie in Canada serve to limit the geographic and economic mobility of francophones and to perpetuate the social and economic dominance of anglophones. Her work urges us to think about categories like anglophone and francophone, not simply as cultural or linguistic categories, which is how we normally see them in Canada, but as economic ones. I also really like Joseph Park's work on South Korea for the ways that he deftly theorizes how affect and also subjectivity are technologies of capital. He shows us how our own feelings, feelings that I think we've heard many of the participants articulate, of linguistic unease or anxiety, or specific to South Korea, the idea that if we just put in a little more work to make things right, we could get there. How those kinds of feelings or subjectivities are both produced by and also benefit capitalism. Third, I'm inspired by work by scholars like Saidiya Hartman and Wendy Brown, and they urge us to consider the illusory promise of concepts like freedom. They show us how offerings of agency can be like little treats that get bestowed upon us in ways that make us feel like we are exercising resistance, when really not much about these actions may actually be changing systems of inequality. Lastly, I am super excited about the work of scholars in indigenous language studies. And I'm thinking here about people like Wesley Leonard, Barbara Meek, and Salt Schwartz, who have taken Audra Simpson's notion of refusal and brilliantly theorized the many ways that we can refuse these oppressive sociolinguistic regimes. These scholars grapple with what Schwartz calls the double bind of language ideology, where taking pains to reclaim languages can function as resistance on the one hand, for sure, but can also be read as capitulation to colonialist logics of language and identity on the other. Whether we let languages go to sleep and move on, or invest time and energy in heritage language reclamation, either way, we run the risk of being read as capitulating to colonial logics. So these scholars argue that refusal and exercising agency can take many forms. We can refuse settler logics of language and identity. We can refuse language death. We can refuse ideologies that argue that change in some languages is dire, while change in others is totally normal. We can refuse labels like semi-speaker or even heritage language speaker, because such labels measure us in terms of distance from some truly authentic monolingual speaker who is both frozen in space and time. I think that thinking with these scholars about more productive ways to mobilize concepts like agency, resistance, and liberation can help us move towards a more just and equitable future. Thank you.
So can you guys hear me okay with this? Okay, great. I just want to start by thanking the panelists for some wonderful talks that have given us a lot to talk about. In terms of the kind of flow of events, I'm going to pose a couple of questions to the whole panel. We'll have a little bit of a conversation among the panelists, hopefully, and maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. And then we'll open up the floor to questions from you all, from the audience. So I guess I want to start by asking, and this is open to anybody or everybody, obviously you're all talking in different ways about discrimination, linguistic discrimination, right? Sort of like some language varieties, some speakers, some variants of a particular language, for example, have greater or lesser value in some given sort of context than others. And that's kind of where resistance comes from, right? Sort of like it's in some ways a form of resisting that hierarchy to sort of elevate the languages that are, or the varieties or the speakers that are being discriminated against. Another thing that for me was a sort of thread through all of your papers in different ways was history, right? So like you all kind of historicized in different ways the past of discrimination, of stigma. And the very fact that you were here talking to us today and sharing your work with us and your work itself sort of suggests a kind of a positive outcome at the end, because after all, you're doing your work, right? And you're letting us all know about it. So there's a kind of, in that structure, there's a kind of implied positive narrative when we get to the end. But I want to ask you what that might be hiding, or maybe to ask it in a different way. Do you feel like discrimination still exists, and how? And if you feel like it still does exist and that's important, where do you see possibilities for changing that reality, for just sort of invoke a little bit of the liberation in the framing of this panel? Or to put it differently, what has changed and what hasn't changed?
I'll break the ice. Discrimination does exist. And so it exists in many forms. So for us, I like to think of a lot of my work in terms of working in equity and in equality. And so for me, equity just boils down to the end of disparity. So if you have disparity, you don't have equity. So what we like to look at is say, what are graduation rates among the different peoples who are attending school? What are incarceration rates of different people who live in a particular place? And what are the rates of police violence against people who live in a particular place? So a lot of the times you're looking at equity in terms of statistics, but it's much deeper than that as well. It's opportunities for one to succeed while being themselves. And so this also involves a lot of our LGBTQ plus communities and those who don't identify within binary systems. And our language is accommodating for a lot of folks because we have non-gendered pronouns for the most part. So when people want us to identify our pronouns, I'm like, oh, we've got really good ones because works for everybody. And so a lot of the work that we do also involves equality, which is saying everybody should have about the same amount of stuff. And so it's trying to balance the difference between the two, like when you should be thinking in terms of one or the other. So for example, if we all came here and there was a big pizza, we could sort of say, oh, well, there's 4 of us and there's 12 pieces, everybody gets 3. But then if we find out that someone hasn't eaten in 2 days, we say, oh, well, I don't need 3. I can have 1. I'll be fine because I just ate a little while ago. So now you're leaning towards equity. So in the work of our languages, a lot of times when we're looking at discrimination, we're looking at places where our languages have been actively banished. And we're also trying to find ways that people hold on to a sense of superiority when they're talking about English. So there were folks who came among us and studied our language for 2 weeks and said their language is not capable of complex thought. And I thought, who are you? You don't know anything. You can't learn our language in 2 weeks. You can't learn anything about it. So sometimes there's this idea of how complex a language is compared to another one, and then also how advanced that language is. So as we started pushing the idea of having schools that would run entirely in our language, and we have language nests that do, and those kids are brilliant and fun and amazing. There was someone who studied anthropology and wrote some books and stuff on our land, and this person sent me an email and said, well, I think creating language immersion schools is wonderful, but I'm just wondering how are you going to get them ready for the real world? Because they need to go out there and be ready to interact with the modern world. And so I said, oh, well, our language, it's really real. And it's modern because it exists today. And so there's pushback to some of these things, but also in another instance, I was testifying to the legislature, and a legislator said, how do you balance the ancient of the indigenous language and the modern of English? And so I said, well, first of all, I thought I can't make fun of people when I'm testifying. And then I also thought I shouldn't be sarcastic, I should be kind. And I said, well, there's a stereotype to what you're talking about, is that English is modern and indigenous languages are primitive, but you're using this word ancient, but you're using a similar concept. And I said, we should examine that and get out of this idea of modernity, where English is the thing that's going to pull everyone to the future. And this future is the same place that everybody needs to go. And then I said, but there's also a bit of truth to what you're saying, and what we have to examine is the fact that our language was banished. It was not allowed to be involved in conversations about science and about understanding a lot of different natural and supernatural phenomena. And we're excluded, and so we don't have a lot of words for things that people do, which if you looked at the time when our language began to be excluded 100 years ago, they didn't have words for these things either. They didn't know what a boiler was. You know, if you go back 100 years ago, maybe they did, I don't know. I'm not a boiler historian. But as we sort of look at these things, now we have to sort of say, well, what do we do now? Because I think capitalism and I think American ideologies tend to give you these very limited options where people say, oh, we would love to, but there's just not enough time. There's just not enough money. The students will fall behind. And so you're presented with all these narratives that can never be proven. It could never be proven that if you just sort of lean towards equity, that people would suffer. But that's the narrative that we're usually presented, is that if we do this, there will be suffering. If we lean towards equity, there will be suffering. And what we're sort of usually hearing is a coded language that we have a phrase, which is, which is, from long ago, we have held our grandchildren above ourselves. We offer up to them the things that we do not want to share. And so not wanting to share is usually one of the primary problems, I think, when you start leaning towards equity and start looking at increasing diversity and equality and trying to create safe spaces for all peoples to just be themselves. Because people don't want to share, because you have a tremendous amount of inequity. You have a tremendous amount of privilege. And for some people who exist, they are so privileged in the systems that have been structured that they imagine everybody having a little bit more of the same level of stuff and opportunities as their own version of suffering. That's the white American Holocaust, is that you have to share. And so for us, that's what we're trying to overcome, and we're trying to sort of, but that's why language is important, because you have to be specific in your terminology. You have to be specific with your intention, because I think the oppressors, they can just make everything very slippery and change what things mean by saying, oh, well, the real racism is talking about racism. You know, I've heard that, and it's just, it makes no sense, so, Richish.
Can I invite any of the other panelists to jump in as well?
I think he almost said everything. But in the case of Haiti, so what I would like to highlight is, so there are 2 official languages on paper. But technically, you know, when you're on the ground, it's kind of difficult, you know, depending on the area you are in Haiti, to see it's really a Francophone country. But now, there's one language, like French, which is associated with prestige, because it's been the language of instruction for so many years. The other one, like Creole, the mother tongue of all Haitians, people always feel like it's not really quite a language because there's a lack of words, as he just said. But we can create words because that's what French, English, and other people, that's what they've been doing. So I think that way of thinking is the result of colonization, because we feel like a language, it's not capable of doing this or doing that. Maybe just, you know, for telling stories, cracking jokes, you know, all of that. But at the same time, what we need to do, we need to bring awareness about, you know, a mother tongue. It's capable, we can create, but to me, I feel like it's not the language, it's us as, you know, human beings, you know, as Haitians. But here in the United States, you know, in my class especially, when students come to class, I always ask them, why do you choose, you know, Creole? Sometimes people say, oh, I would like, you know, to speak it pretty well. I said, how long would it take you, you know, to speak it well or to be fluent? But you got some answers like, oh, maybe a year or 2 years. I said, really? just living here in the United States, and then after 1 year, you'll master my mother tongue. And I've been here for so many years, and I'm still struggling with your mother tongue. Maybe you think like your brain is better than mine. I think it's kind of like perception too, when people think, okay, there are some languages that are very easy. So they're not complicated, they're not complex. But my question is, I know you're here to ask the question, but how can you tell language it's like so easy, it's not complicated, when you don't speak it? How can you tell it? If you don't speak it, how can? I think it's kind of like assumption that there are some people who are, maybe they think they're superior to others, and they think like whatever they do are more valuable, than others.
Thank you. Other two panelists, would either of you like to jump in? If not, I'll ask another question. Yes, please.
I will. So it's right. I know people say things about sign language. Oh, sign language is so easy to learn. I'm like, slow it down. It's not. It's definitely complicated. It takes several years and immersion in the community to acquire it at a level of fluency. But they just think, oh, it's just moving your hands. It's so simple. And let me tell you, it's definitely not. And so thinking about discrimination or language discrimination, linguistic discrimination in the community, we definitely have that and experience that for sure. But in the deaf community, we really, follow right in line with American history. You have systemic oppression, and the same thing applies to minoritized groups, like the deaf community. It's the same trickle-down effect that happens with American Sign Language, and you already know how discrimination happens with language, especially with Black American Sign Language. You start to notice different layers and levels of oppression. And we're faced with linguistic oppression, and then we have racial oppression, and we have autism and disability. We are pressed for a myriad of things, and we have to go through and address those different levels of oppression constantly. But I wanted to expand a little bit more about why you don't see Black American Sign Language enough in the deaf community. So if you look at the history, of course, they set up the institutes with the intention of educating deaf students, teaching them to read. Back during that time, they had religious motivation, wanted to save their souls because they can't speak. I mean, how do you know holy and godly words? That was the belief back in the day. Like, really, it was. And so, like, oh, you can sign? Okay, I need to teach you. I can teach this. I can teach you to communicate and read. You're all set. But later down the line, there was a shift. There was a feeling that spoken language was the right thing, was perfection that showed your humanity, and they felt like sign language didn't. And so that group of sign language users was consequently oppressed. And that started this effect that the community had to fight to change the mindset of language. It's a language, and there will be variations, and they need to be included. Sign language needed to be included in that. And so they were just so harping on the fact that language had to be spoken. And still to this day, that is a layer of oppression that we're fighting against on a systemic level. People who are born to, that are not deaf, when they have deaf children, they ask the doctor, what do I do? And they say, what do you suggest? What do you think? And they're like, oh, let's do an audiogram. They're talking about implants, cochlear implants, hearing aids, but it's not very often that sign language is recommended. Secondly, when it comes to Black ASL and the lack of visibility, again, if you look in the school system, you'll often see education and language have a symbiotic relationship. It's because deaf people learn language in the schools. So in schools, they will have many white deaf children that congregate, and they will have their network that is sustained from elementary to post-secondary. And you have Gallaudet University, for example, Rochester Institute for Technology or National Technical Institute for the Deaf, RIT-NTID, and CSUN. You had those three options where deaf students would migrate to for college. And during that time, American Sign Language was very visible and widespread. It was all over the internet. It was everywhere. But at the same time, when it came to the Black residential schools for the deaf, education really topped out at about 6th to 8th grade. And that was a common experience, particularly in the southern region. So it was a focus on vocational studies. And so that meant that those who wanted to go to college couldn't because they weren't qualified, essentially, to go to college linguistically. So that means that language was not taken to universities like Gallaudet University. And so it was essentially blocking the dissemination of that rich language that is Black American Sign Language. And that resulted in another form of oppression in education. But as laws began to shift, they had an impact on language use inside the school system. So there was a lot of discrimination on the systemic level as it relates to education, as it relates to language use. And yeah, those two are the most important that I'll mention today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think maybe I'll ask one more question, and then I'll invite the audience to ask questions. So this question has to do with, I guess, what I would say kind of the limits of language, or the either as an analyst, am I looking at a problem and trying to understand it, but also sort of practically trying to redress oppression, stigma, discrimination in some sense as a practical problem. And in order to, I want to contextualize this question, sort of where it comes from, by saying it kind of comes out of my own research, and so it's going to take me a minute to explain it. Please forgive me, but I think it will help you see where I'm coming from with the question, and I hope it will be helpful for the panelists as well. So I work in Oaxaca, Mexico, which is one of the most linguistically diverse places on earth. Lots of indigenous languages spoken in a relatively small area. One of my new projects involves interpretation in medical context. So when indigenous people go to the hospital or clinics, often they're not, supported kind of not at all when it comes to medical interpretation, right? And this project, which involves people like me who are kind of outsiders, not native speakers of indigenous languages, but also people who are native speakers of indigenous languages, sort of language activists of various sorts. It came out of the realization that that although in other domains, sort of legal domain, education, political domain, there was a lot of support for indigenous languages, flawed, but there was a system, right? So like if you got accused of a crime, there was actually a system in place where the state had to provide an interpreter for you, and there was a growing sort of effort to sort of redress that. But in medical context, kind of nothing. So we started working on this project, and shortly after this project started, there was this event that happened where an indigenous woman from Oaxaca, who was about to have a baby, goes to the clinic, saying, I'm in labor, I'm about to have my baby, and they refused to let her come into the clinic, and she had her baby on the grass in front of the clinic. One of her neighbors took a picture, uploaded it to the internet, and it went viral, so it was like international news. In Mexico, it was kind of like a real watershed event in the kind of public awareness of some of the problems with, particularly medical, with translation in general, but lack of translation in medical context in particular. And language was so central to the way it was talked about. In particular, when the Secretary of Health was like, his initial response was, but she didn't speak, what were we supposed to do? She didn't speak Spanish. Which produced a huge backlash and a lot of anger about it. Activists all over the country were talking about how much a problem it is, discrimination in general, but in particular the kind of the lack of resources to support indigenous languages was a big part of the problem. But when I interviewed her with my collaborators, first of all, she spoke fluent Spanish, right? So she could actually express herself just fine. So there's that question of sort of like when language becomes a cover for something else, and when anxieties about language are really cover for something else. But her complaints were about sort of like, duplicity and promises that the government officials didn't come through on, and deep-seated discrimination. And I have to say, in my 20 years I've been working in Oaxaca, I have never heard some of the racist things. I mean, not even ambiguously racist, just like flat-out racist things in medical contexts. And while I still think it's really important to provide support for people who speak indigenous languages, that experience is increasingly making me question how I should think about the importance of language and the focus that's what we bring. We're focusing on language. It's obviously very important. But are there shortcomings of centering language, I suppose? Are there limits of language, or is language so central and so important that if we pay attention to language, other things will get dragged along? And I'm just curious to know if the panelists would think about some of those issues with respect to their own work.
Okay, I'm going to be brave and try to take this one. I feel that I am having the same midlife academic crisis, perhaps, that Paja just explained, as someone who is,
I guess that would be a good way to put it. Thank you.
I was a linguistics major, and then I got a master's in applied linguistics, and I had PhDs in linguistic anthropology, so it's been like language all the way. And I have to say, recently, I have started thinking, maybe it's not language. Or maybe, not that it's not language, but are there ways in which the focus on language can unwittingly lead us astray, or lead us to be blind to other kinds of inequities that might persist, right? So I guess I have two kind of examples there. And one is, okay, on the one hand, I think it's amazing that at elite universities like this, we are having discussions about decolonization and things I never thought when I was a student I would ever see in my lifetime, right? Like, it's incredible, right? It's great. On the other hand, I am a little concerned about the ways that so many of the efforts that I see, at least in my own sphere, at language and social justice, seem to really rely on these like referentialist ideologies of language. And what I'm talking about there is sort of the idea that like, if we just get rid of the bad words and we could use the good words, then like, goodness will be forthcoming, right? So I'm thinking about the fact that my university's EDI office seems to run like 75 workshops a year, in which, as far as I can tell, the point of the workshop is I show up and they're like, don't say this, say that, don't say this, say that, don't say this, say that. And I'm like, okay, this is the magic list in June 2021, but 3 months from now, you're gonna tell me it's a different magic list. And you're gonna tell me the words that I was saying in June are now bad, and I'm gonna have a new word. And I'm like, what is the point of these very highly paid professionals running these workshops over and over again on my campus, right? And I just think, could we take these resources and do something else with them? Could I take this entire office and like actually affect social change, And I worry about things like that, right? I guess that's just me being sort of like cynical and a little old, or I feel very old in these moments, right? When I express things like that, because of course my students are like, yes, this is exactly what we should be focusing on, the right word. And I'm like, I don't think the right word is where it's at. I guess the other thing in thinking about this in relation to your earlier question in terms of hope, so in some ways, there has been so much progress, like it's great to see support for multilingualism institutionalized. It's amazing that we have so much support for things like dual immersion schools, or things that just weren't available when I was growing up in upstate New York, like in the 70s. And that is fabulous, right? But then on the other hand, I live in a settler colony with lots of state support for multilingualism. And you know what? It's not like we are now living in the promised land in Canada because the state has said, yes, everyone should learn French and English, right? I'm not sure that state support for multilingualism, you know, in and of itself disrupts the logics of colonialism, disrupts this notion that some languages are more modern than others, right? You know, actually sort of changes anything, right? And I'm thinking about, I mean, both in Canada, right? You know, where Monica Heller has shown, even though the state supports multilingualism, surprise, it's still the elite multilinguals who benefit, right? It's still the kids who have a lot of social capital and learn their French in school. They're the ones who are recognized, and of course the kids who, you know, bring their French from some other place or speak it at home, they do not benefit, right? I guess the other ethnographic example would be, of course, South Korea, right? Where, you know, Joseph Park has argued that, like, everyone now thinks that they have to become minimum fluent in Korean and English and maybe another language or two, right? So for them, this is not some wonderful experience of, you know, release or transformation. This is like a huge burden, right? Because they have to spend all this time and all this effort and all this money, you know, mastering and forever for the like lifelong project of, you know, always working hard to become better multilinguals. So I guess I think maybe it's not all about language, but then that leaves the question of what is it all about? Capital.
In that case, I will bring it to a close and ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for their great talks. Hopefully some of the conversation can continue over the reception, which is just behind you. So please join us for the reception, and thank you again for coming.